Hi, I'm Peter J. Ray. Welcome. Today's topic is Resalest Remarkable Books, number 71. The first book today is The Burning Tigris, The Armenian Genocide and America's Response by Peter Balakian, 2003. This is really something, this book, outstanding. In the 1890s and in 1915, Turks in the Ottoman Empire murdered 1.5 million ethnic Armenian people. Up to now, the Turks deny this. There were many American missionaries there. Armenia is the oldest Christian country in the world. Interesting. American missionaries inspired them to want better treatment. They had been traditionally abused by the Turks. There should have been a Western military invasion to save them and establish an independent Armenia. That's my opinion. The genocide was part of Islamic Jihad. Americans raised a lot of money for Armenian relief. In the 1890s, the Ottoman Sultan Abdul Hamid II saw plots against him everywhere, including the chemical formula for water, H2O, which he ordered banned from science textbooks and chemistry textbooks in the empire. He thought it was a secret sign that he was so paranoid. He thought H2O meant Hamid II is nothing. So he had H2O banned from chemistry and science textbooks. Crazy guy. With the rise of petroleum, the Cold War, and the War on Terror, the Turks demand silence regarding the Armenian genocide for their cooperation. God bless us all. Yeah, as we know, the Middle East is the half of the world's petroleum, which is the basis for gasoline for cars. It comes from the Middle East, and then we've had the Cold War fighting communism, especially the Russians, and now the War on Terror or Islamic Jihad. And the U.S. has had military bases in Turkey. So now the thing is, the Armenian Americans, who have political influence, they're mad about what happened. That this murder of 1.5 million Armenians. Actually, the Kardashians, they're Armenian American. And they want a public acknowledgement that this happened from the Turks, and they want an apology. But so far, the Turks have refused to do this. And the thing is, we live in this is a violent world, and this is not the only genocide that has happened. Not that I'm excusing this, but I'm sure for the Turks, it's a very painful thing. And actually, this was, coming to the end of the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire was the last large Muslim empire, and it was ruled by Turks, and it included many countries now were part of the Ottoman Empire in, Turkey and Middle East, and into the Balkan Peninsula, these countries that are now countries like Syria, Jordan, and so forth, Israel, going into Central Asia and into North Africa. And actually, it was a multi-ethnic empire. All these different ethnic groups, a lot of Greeks, there were Jews, Armenians, Kurds, and other Arabs, and so forth. And they actually got along for a long time, and then it all fell apart in the late 1800s. The development of this was one of the curses of the 20th century: severe ethnic conflict, and that fell apart. The Turks had been at the top; they had political power, and then and the thing is, Turks are Muslim, and Armenians were an ethnic group, an ethnic minority in the Ottoman Empire that were Christian. And so this happened, and the thing is, the Ottoman Empire broke up, and the Turks lost everything. Now they still have Turkey, which is a small part of the former Ottoman Empire. They went through severe hard times. Turkey is actually I believe the only or one of the very few Muslim countries that has some tradition of democracy, and this has been a political football. There's been pressure on the American government to make a statement of that this happened, and the Turks are are very upset. They get if that they will stop cooperating with the U.S. in its geopolitical interests in the Middle East regarding petroleum and so forth. So this is really something, and a very fascinating book, and it's controversial. I think if you have Turkish friends today, this could be problematic. And actually, Turkey or the Ottoman Turks, part of their empire was what's now Jerusalem, including or Israel, including the holy city of Jerusalem, which is a holy city for Christians, Jews, and Muslims, and it was during the Crusades, the Christians of Europe that was their goal to take Jerusalem back from the Muslims, because this is where Jesus Christ lived and died and was crucified. And finally, the Crusaders succeeded briefly, but generally they failed and remained under Muslim rule until 1918, when General Edmund Allenby of the British Army defeated the Turks, and then Jerusalem. Since then, it was British controlled, and then since the creation of modern Israel, basically under Jewish control. And so the Turks were pretty upset about this General Edmund Allenby. There's a street in the Philippines, in Metro Manila, San Juan, called Allenby Street, and it's also an inclined plane. And actually, there's a previous video that I made here on YouTube called Star Wars History and Physics, and it gets into that whole that story. It's kind of a story that I came up with, because there are actually Turks. There's a Turkish school, Fountain International Academy, which is not too far away from our school, Resalest Educational Center, which is on Allenby Street, named after this General Allenby, and an inclined plane, a physics concept. So anyway, this is an amazing book. I highly recommend it. Very interesting, a very painful topic, and we should have the courage to face history and face these things, because they happened. That's a friend of mine said to a friend of mine was talking to me one time. He gave me a book to read, and I told him it was depressing, and he said, "But it happened." He was Croatian, dealing with what happened to them, actually a lesser genocide their sufferings in the Balkan Peninsula. The next book is Love and Hate in Jamestown by John Smith, Pocahontas and the Heart of a New Nation by David A. Price, 2003. Wow, this is an outstanding and amazing book. The earliest days of the English in North America, 1607 in Virginia. This is actually before the second settlement in Massachusetts, I believe. Jamestown, Virginia. John Smith is the father of Virginia, a good man, hardworking, down to earth, realistic, and brave. Many of the early English settlers were lazy, naive, arrogant, obsessed with finding gold. And of course, there was no gold in that part of America. It was the gold and silver were down in Mexico and Peru. John Smith's leadership was critical. Good guy. The Powhatan princess Pocahontas saved his life when Smith was a prisoner scheduled for execution. Prisoner of of these Powhatan Indians. Pocahontas was later an English prisoner who chose to stay with the English. She liked Christianity and the English humane treatment of women. King Powhatan collected 80% tribute from some subservient Indian tribes. Now this is my opinion. The Indians lost America in large part because of intra-Indian nation hatred, a culture of cruelty, abuse of women, and evil religious leaders. This is all politically incorrect, because the only people you can blame today in today's culture is white people. And you can't talk about any things that were problematic in Indian culture, because then you're a racist, But anyway, I'm not interested in being politically correct. I'm interested in being honest and open. Early on, the English and the Indians got along fairly well. On March 22, 1622, the Powhatan Indians, led by Chief Opachan Kanaw, made a surprise attack and murdered 400 of the 1,200 English colonists. However, the English population continued to rise. There were 1,200 English settlers in Virginia in 1624, 2,600 in 1629, 3,200 in 1632, and 5,200 in 1634. This is very early in American history. John Smith believed in the American dream: hard work, individual initiative, freedom, and realism, free enterprise, private property, honesty, strength, and opportunity. Of course, if you've seen the Disney movie Pocahontas, they took some liberties, but it deals with these. And of course, people probably are mostly aware of John Smith and Pocahontas. They did not actually. They were friends. She felt sorry for him, but they didn't. I believe they did not have a romantic relationship, which is implied in that movie. So this is very interesting, early American history, and John Smith, Pocahontas, and that was the interesting part. When Pocahontas, she had become a prisoner of the English, and then it turns out at one point she did not want to go back. They had paid a bribe or whatever to have her released, and she did not want to go back because the American Indian women were really not treated well. They did most of the work. They didn't have political rights, and Christianity does have this humane element. We're supposed to love each other, and there was wisdom in American Indian religion, but there were also problems. There were problems, and the Indians they had so much. They've been fighting each other for centuries, the different Indian nations. So this is a very interesting book. The beginning of American history, the history of the United States, very early in the 1600s. I really recommend this book. The next book is Wellington: The Maras, the Giants, and the City of New York by Carlo DeVito, 2006. This is the story of the NFL New York Giants and their owners, the Mara family, going back to the 1920s. They won many NFL championships. Interesting players like Y.A. Tittle. There was a famous photograph of him being after play. He's in the end zone on his knees with blood flowing down his forehead. His helmet had been knocked off. Frank Gifford, who became famous as a Monday Night Football announcer in the 1970s. Sam Huff. How the NFL dramatically changed. And again, the success of the New York Giants, who have been one of the most successful NFL teams because of a good family. And I believe the Maras still own them from the beginning up until now. Good people, and a very interesting book. Wellington Mara, I believe, was the first Mara who owned the team. I believe he's gone now. The next book is Millard Fillmore, Biography of a President by Robert J. Rayback, 1959. This is a good book, 445 pages. I ordered it online from Amazon, which is really an amazing way to buy books. Used books. You can get books for actually $5-6 that are used but are still very good on any topic. And it's amazing service, Amazon. This book gave me more material for my Millard Fillmore talk, which eventually I'll do on YouTube, and which I have actually it's all ready to go. It's a positive look at his life. Millard Fillmore lived a rags to riches life. He worked hard and was a good man. He was unfairly demonized for signing the Fugitive Slave Act. Fillmore was vice president and assumed the presidency upon the death of Zachary Taylor. He sent Commodore Matthew Perry to Japan and opened that country to world trade. Fillmore was a devoted citizen of Buffalo, New York. He got caught in the middle of the war over slavery, the severe conflict which led to the U.S. Civil War. His life shows the power of hard work and reading books. God bless Millard Fillmore, a man who served his country well. Yeah, he's been demonized, this whole issue of the fugitive slave law, and it's all still debatable now. And I don't know. The thing is, slavery was absolutely wrong, and it needed to end. And I don't know. We seem to want to have scapegoats for people who, politicians, as they say, politics is the art of the possible. You do what you can, and there are limitations to what you can do based on the times and the conditions. The next book is Warriors of God: Richard the Lionheart and Saladin in the Third Crusade by James Reston Jr., 2001. This is an amazing book, extremely interesting. This talk about history being fascinating. This book takes place around the year 1190, so that's more than 800 years ago. Wow. The English and French Crusade, led by English King Richard the Lionheart, to recapture the Christian holy city of Jerusalem from the Muslims, who were led by the very noble Saladin. It didn't happen. They didn't succeed. The Christians didn't succeed. Richard lost heart. They called him Richard the Lionheart, so kind of ironic that he lost heart in this a very challenging quest. And the British finally took Jerusalem from the Turks in 1917, led by General Edmund Allenby. We've talked about that. There's a street in San Juan, Metro Manila, Philippines, called Allenby Street, where our school, Resalest Educational Center, is located. In 1920, French General Henry Giraud went to Saladin's tomb in Damascus when the French took Syria and said, quote, "Saladin, we have returned. My presence here consecrates the victory of the cross over the crescent." The cross meaning Christianity, and the crescent, which is the symbol of Islam. So this was, for historians, 1917, for Christian European historians, 1917 was final victory in the Crusades, which had been a failure for Europeans centuries earlier. In 1182, the ruler of Kerak in the region of Israel, Reginald of Chatillon, planned to attack Mecca and Medina and drag the prophet Muhammad, whom he called this accursed camel driver, from his tomb and raze to the ground the Kaaba, the sacred stone of Mecca, to which all Muslims turn to pray. So, wow, just imagine, all hell would have broken loose. That did not happen. He didn't do it, but he was threatening the holy cities of Mecca and Medina. And the Muslims are already mad enough about the fact that Jerusalem, which they consider a holy city, but Mecca, especially Mecca and Medina are both the most holy cities for Muslims. And he was threatening to attack them, destroy them, and destroy Muhammad's tomb. Gosh. Now here's a quote from the book. "The stories of Richard's daring and strength were legion, as were the stories of his cruelty." And we're talking about Richard the Lionheart. "His generosity and his poetic sensibility. His troubadours claim for him the valor of Hector and the magnanimity of Achilles, the stature of Alexander the Great and Roland, the liberality of Titus." That reminds me of Robin Williams, talked about Titus. "Come hither, Titus," reference to Shakespeare. "The eloquence of Nestor." I have a friend in the Philippines named Nestor. "And the prudence of Ulysses." Of course, Ulysses comes from, Homer. According to one legend, when Richard the Lionheart was imprisoned in Germany after the Crusade, a hungry lion was brought to his cell. Richard stuck his arm deep in the lion's mouth and throat and ripped out the heart, brought it to his captors, squeezed out the blood, dipped it in salt, and ate it. Wow, what a story. Sounds like a tall tale. The legend of Robin Hood comes from this time. I could not believe it when I was reading this book when Richard decided to not take Jerusalem because like I said, he lost heart. He was, tired for whatever reasons, after all the effort. And, he's like, what? You're going to give up? Because he was already, in the area. Now, in this book, Saladin is the hero of the story, a great Muslim, brave, honest, just, kind, and humble. And ever since then, so for Muslims, Saladin is someone they revere, in large part because of his military success, because he was able to secure Jerusalem for Muslims. And ever since then, for the last 800 years, Muslims have been looking for a new Saladin. I was talking to a Palestinian guy at Cleveland State University a couple years ago when I was a student there, and I mentioned I'd heard that Saddam Hussein, who wanted to apparently create a big Muslim empire and said that he was the next Saladin. And what he was mostly referring to is his hope that he could become a great military leader and create a huge Muslim empire. And I told this guy that Saddam Hussein was never going to become the next Saladin because he was cruel. And the thing is, yes, Saladin was a great and successful military leader, but just as important, he was a good guy. He was honest. He was just, kind, and humble. And Saddam Hussein was cruel, so he could not have become the next Saladin. So this is an amazing book. I highly recommend it. The next book is Candide, or Optimism, by François-Marie Arouet de Voltaire, 1759. I read this book for my Western Civilization II course at Cleveland State University in 2016. The professor was Mark Cole. We had to write a 3-page paper on Candide. It's a famous book. I read my friend Dinah Lestheim's copy and online on the computer. It's a short book, only 131 pages, and supposedly he wrote it in 3 days. And I was not crazy about this book. Candide is the main character. He travels all over and has many adventures and experiences a lot of cruelty. He goes to France, England, Holland, Italy, Turkey, Argentina, Paraguay, he's in South America, Suriname, French Guyana, and El Dorado, the mythical paradise. At the end, he decides simple living on his farm in Turkey is the best. And the famous line is, we must cultivate our garden. So this is considered an Enlightenment classic novel. The Enlightenment was really an intellectual movement in Europe that you could say changed the world because it led to, this was in the 1700s. The capital could be considered Paris, France, where Europeans started thinking more and learning more and being more inquisitive. Because in the Middle Ages, people had been pretty ignorant and depressed, and then this emphasis on learning in the 1700s really changed the world and led to European countries becoming powerful and really led to the United States. The United States, you could say, was an Enlightenment creation. So this book, Candide, is a famous book by Voltaire. Voltaire is a famous French author, and they used to say that he made the presses groan for many years because he wrote so much. And this my professor Mark Cole really enjoyed it. So we had to write this paper, and I wasn't crazy about it, but it's a famous book, and it's good to be aware of it. So anyway, the next book is Johnny U: The Life and Times of John Unitas by Tom Callahan, 2006. I was reading this book because it was the end of the NFL season. Johnny Unitas, native of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Actually, I think the Browns we could have gotten him in Cleveland. He won multiple NFL titles for the old Baltimore Colts in 1958, 1959, and 1970. He lost the 1964 title game to Cleveland and Super Bowl III to Joe Namath and the New York Jets. Webb Eubank was one of his coaches, Don Shula. He lost the 1958 NFL title game, which they call the greatest game ever played. So this is a good book. Johnny Unitas, famous player in the 1950s in the NFL. The next book is Mayflower: A Story of Courage, Community, and War by Nathaniel Philbrick, 2006. This is the story of the Puritans, the Pilgrims, the English colonization of New England. So kind of what what we talked earlier about Virginia. These two areas that were colonies, became states, Massachusetts and Virginia. This is where the beginning of American history. In this case, New England, Plymouth, Boston, Massachusetts, Miles Standish, who was a famous English leader, Massasoit was an Indian, Squanto, another Indian, Benjamin Church, King Philip was another Indian. And so the time period in this book is from 1620 to 1676. The Indian Wars, the tragedy that the all-out Indian War happened and Indians were sold into slavery. The author wrote this quote, "In the American popular imagination, the nation's history began with the Pilgrims and then leapfrogged more than 150 years to Lexington and Concord and the Revolution." And then he continues, quote, "Instead of loathing the enemy, try to learn as much as possible from him instead of killing him. Try to bring him around to your way of thinking. First and foremost, treat him like a human being." Yeah, so this book gets into the tragedy of that you can't get around in American history of what happened to American Indians, because this the United States, all of the what's now the United States was Indian land, and so this is we should face this, what happened to Indians, and it was an unbelievable tragedy, but it doesn't mean we have to blame the European immigrants for what they did, and because I don't know how the Indians could not have lost big time. Of course, we all, we live in a cruel world, and I think every country has been created through conquest. So, American history was a war of a European conquest of American Indians. The thing is, the Indians themselves had been fighting wars of conquest against each other. And all over the world, people have been doing this. So, if you want to blame the European immigrants for what they did to Indians, it's just world history. But we should be aware of it and have the courage to face it, because it happened. And but also give credit to the Indian fighters, because courage is a virtue, and it seems like we don't have respect for courage in today's world, and we should. The next book is Driven West, Andrew Jackson and the Trail of Tears to the Civil War by A.J. Languth, 2010. Very interesting book. The story of the Cherokee Indians and their removal from the east, especially Georgia, to points west, including what's now Oklahoma. Andrew Jackson is villainized for this. There was a character named Woman Killer, a Cherokee Indian, said the Cherokees were linked to the United States, quote, by a golden chain of friendship, made when our friendship was worth a price. And if they act the tyrant and kill us for our lands, we shall, in a state of unoffending innocence, sleep with thousands of our departed people. Well, that's a very touching statement. Theodore Freilunghuisen said this, quote, I had rather the blessing of one poor Cherokee, as he casts his last look upon his country, for having, though in vain, attempted to prevent his banishment, than to sleep beneath the marble of all the Caesars. So this was an American who felt so bad about what was done to the Cherokee Indians when they were removed from Georgia and moved to Oklahoma. John Howard Payne wrote this, quote, "Mid the pleasures and palaces, though we may roam, be it ever so humble, there's no place like home." Oh, that's a famous quote that we still hear today. A guy named Private Burnett in 1838 said this, "Murder is murder, and somebody must answer. Somebody must explain the streams of blood that flowed in the Indian country in the summer of 1838. Somebody must explain the 14,000 silent graves that mark the trail of the Cherokees to their exile. I wish I could forget it all, but the picture of 645 wagons lumbering over the frozen ground with their cargo of suffering humanity still lingers in my memory." And he's talking about when they were moved west and it wasn't done properly. They didn't have enough to eat. A lot of them got sick and died. They didn't have enough shelter from the elements. William Henry Harrison, who was elected president in 1840, said this in 1841, quote, "I can conceive of no more sublime spectacle, none more likely to propitiate an impartial and common Creator than a rigid adherence to the principles of justice on the part of a powerful nation in its transactions with a weaker and uncivilized people whom circumstances have placed at its disposal." So he's talking here about, he was one of the great Indian fighters, and he was saying that we should treat the Indians better, and we should have. But this is world history. Human beings should have treated each other better, and all we can do is try to do better today. I still think that Andrew Jackson is the hero and should stay on the $20 bill, but the story of the Cherokees should be told. So this is a really interesting book. It's very painful, but we need to face these things in history that happen. So it appears we're out of time. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you find a good history book to read. God bless all the historians and authors of history books who work so hard and do all this work to focus on a topic, gather information, and write incredible history books. Thank you so much for watching. God bless you. Take care, and I'll see you next time.